Now I'm thrilled to have back with us the Australian newspaper's Washington correspondent, Adam Creighton, who is also that paper's former economics correspondent. Adam, I want to play a little clip from that interview Joe Biden did with CNN.
Should the American people prepare for a recession?
No. Look, they've been saying this now every 6 months they say this. Every 6 months they look down the next 6 months and see what's going to happen. It hadn't happened yet.
Adam, what's he talking about? I mean, surely on the ground, everyone in America knows that they're in a recession, right?
Well, certainly they know that a recession is coming. I mean, there's going to be higher interest rates all the time. We've just seen inflation this week in the US, very worrying. The core inflation was up 6.6%, the highest in 42 years. So that gives the Federal Reserve here a little option, but to ratchet up interest rates ever more. In the housing market, for instance, we're already seeing new home loan rates, new 30-year rates at 7%, which is more than double of 1 year ago. So just imagine what that does demand for home building, for new car purchases and so forth. So certainly, if the recession is not here yet, and the president does understandably point to the jobless rate, 3.5%, still extremely low by historical standards. But we do know from history that that jobless rate can increase very quickly. And that is the great fear here.
Now, I want to stick Adam on economic matters here, and specifically oil, which, of course, is a big component to inflation. In that CNN interview, the president also said that he didn't go to the Middle East on his trip seeking more oil, and yet now the Wall Street Journal is reporting that Joe Biden actually begged OPEC not to cut production before the midterms, lest gas prices spike again. And there are reports that this was linked to the issue of arms sales. Now, this cannot be a good look for America's reputation overseas, can it?
No, look, I don't think it is. And I think I trust the Wall Street Journal reporting there rather than the spin from the White House. I think the whole situation is extremely embarrassing. I mean, the US has had troops stationed in Saudi Arabia for many years. It's an ally. And yet, certainly Saudi Arabia orchestrated that cut in production. Very embarrassing for the US. It's likely to tip the scales in the midterm elections, of course, by putting upward pressure on the price of petrol here, which will make Americans more likely to vote Republican. So the Democrats are very, very angry, but there's very, very little that they can do about it. They have essentially abrogated their energy independence through various climate change policies, which enriches and grants more and more power to nations like Saudi Arabia.
And as I think we've said on this show many times before, the very first thing that Joe Biden did when he came into office was to axe the Keystone Pipeline, which, of course, would have been a huge bit of infrastructure for American energy independence. But I wanted to take things now back to Australia a bit here, because right now Australian Treasurer Jim Chalmers is in Washington taking meetings with the Feds and the IMF. Now, you mentioned those interest rates and the Fed policy. That's, of course, hurting the Australian currency. What advice do you think Jim Chalmers is going to get in Washington that he's going to bring back to Australia?
Well, look, he just had a press conference a few hours ago, and it seemed he was pretty rattled after the meetings that he'd had today. He met with Janet Yellen, he met with the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, and of course it was just a few hours when he spoke after those inflation figures came out. His message was that it's got to be a very responsible budget, that any new spending must be extremely targeted. And he said, which I thought was interesting for a Labor Treasurer, that there would be a lot of spending cuts. Now, look, it certainly remains to be seen what those spending cuts are. And I must say I'm a little sceptical that we'll see any substantial, but he did say that. So let's hope we hold it to him when he brings down that budget on the 25th of October. But yeah, the message is concerning. Australia is a relatively small economy in a world that appears to be going into a serious recession shortly, that's been induced by these extremely high interest rates. And it must be said, why is inflation so high? It all stems back to all of those lockdowns and the crazy spending that accompanied them. That is the ultimate cause. And I think it's really important that people don't forget that.
Adam Creighton, I think you're right. Thank you so much for joining us from Washington, and hope to catch up with you in a few weeks when I'm there for the midterms. Thanks very much for your time, Adam.